And so, this evening, as we look into the history of Israel since God made this challenge, and the challenge is, this is how you know who I am, we can see that nothing more attests to the reliability of Scriptures than the remarkable way God has kept His Word. And you can see that as you read the paper or follow the news every day. By the way, I don't mean that every day there will be an article about some prophetic thing in the paper, but every day, if you read the news, you'll find a critical article about Israel. Every day. They can't do anything right. And that's what we'll see as the sixth promise God made, that they would be hated by everybody. So if you listen or read or watch the news and find Israel or Jerusalem or the Temple Mount mentioned, you are hearing an echo of God's promises and predictions. You understand that? Every time, 2,600 years after the destruction of Jerusalem and the dissolution of the state of Israel, 2,600 years later, anybody that would hear about Israel or them being a nation or them having Jerusalem or them wanting to build a temple, you're hearing an echo of a promise God made. And those echoes and that reverberation is getting louder every day. And if in your mind you think about in the past month, have you heard or seen any news about Israel? I mean, they can't lift a finger over there. They cut off the oil to the poor people living in the Gaza Strip. By the way, you've heard about refugee camps, right? You ought to go visit one. I visit refugee camps in Israel all the time. A lot of them are nicer than houses you live in. They are. We think of squalor. We think of tents and people dying. They have color plasma screen TVs. They've got, cell phones. They've got carpet. It's beautiful. And they live right on the water. They live right on the beautiful Mediterranean. They call it a refugee camp. It's because you can't say anything positive about Israel. Now, Israel is heavy-handed. I will say that. They're living in unbelief. They're very proud and arrogant and on and on and on. They're sinners. But that doesn't change the fact they're God's chosen people of promise, whether you like them or not. And God says, the eyes of the world will be on the Jews like no other people, the city of Jerusalem like no other city. And Jerusalem will grow as time gets near the end into a burden for the world that will hang around the necks of all the nations. That's Zechariah 12, 1 through 3. Jerusalem will be like this heavy rock that's causing everybody to be bent over, and they're saying, let's get rid of this. This is harming us. And that's just what God predicted 2,600 years ago. Well, let's go back for a little review. Let's go back to Genesis 15. And I'm going to give you the other 5, just mention them to see if you wrote them in your Bible. And then I'm going to show you one more tonight. Because last time we were together, that was July 12th, last time I talked about Israel, I told you there are 12 keys God has given us in His Word to identify what nation among all the nations will signal the end of days. And the signals God give point all of them, the signs point all to Israel. And what I mean by that is, number one, God says, I'm staking my reputation on a people I identify as my chosen people. And if you look at Genesis 15 specifically, you see what the Lord says at the end of the chapter. It says this, and it came to pass, verse 17 of Genesis 15, when the sun went down and it was dark, behold, there was a smoking oven and a burning torch, and it passed. On the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, look at verse 18, to your descendants. By the way, the structure of the book of Genesis is around this genealogy of. And it starts out with the generations or genealogies of the heavens and the earth. And then it's the genealogies of Noah. Then it's the genealogy of the descendants of Noah. And it picks out Shem. And then it's the descendants of Abraham. And then it goes to the descendants of Jacob. And God locates the family through whom His promises will go. And it's through Abraham, but not through all of his kids. Abraham had many children. He after Ishmael and Isaac, he had concubines, and he had all of these Arabic peoples that live all over the people of the East. And so God says, no, not just all, but just Isaac. But then Isaac had 2. Remember? He had Jacob and Esau, and Esau's children are the Edomites, and that's Herod, and so they spread out all over the place. So God says, no, it's not just Abraham, not just Isaac, it's Jacob's descendants and his 12 sons. And so look what it says in this 18th verse. To your descendants. And not all of them, but he keeps narrowing it down as the book goes on. I have given this land from the river of Egypt, the great river, the river Euphrates, the Kenites, the Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, and the Girgashites, and the Jebusites, their land. I give it to you. That was 4,000 years ago. And that promise has never been abrogated. It's just been set aside. And in modern times is the first time that they have started going back and staking out that land and taking it back. So number one, God stakes his reputation on the descendants of Abraham, the descendants of Isaac, the descendants of Jacob, whom he names Israel. Secondly, God promised to give a land with clear boundaries to them. What I just read, back up to verse 7 of the same chapter, 15:7, he says, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldees to give you this land. So God identifies a people, descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he identifies a geographic spot. That's why when the United Nations offered Israel Kenya, they said, we'll give you some land up in Kenya. You can have your country over there in Africa. You know, jungle, water, grow stuff, diamonds, you can polish them. And they said, we don't want Kenya. And they said, we want that barren rock that nothing grows on. No one's ever got anything to grow on there. We want that. There's no natural resources, no diamonds, there's no agriculture. We just want that. Because Genesis 15:7, God gave you this land, not any other. So that's the second key to understanding. God chose a people, God chose a land. Then, turn to the next book, Exodus 6. The people left the land. Remember, they went to Egypt and took a 400-year vacation in Egypt, if you can call it that. And it says in Exodus 6, verses 7 and 8, the third element of these big piles of God's promises, God promised to bring his chosen people of destiny into that promised land after they left it. Remember when the famine came, that Joseph sent up the wagons and brought Jacob and all of his family, and 70 souls went down into Egypt, and they stayed there, the entire nation of Egypt, for 400 years. And they weren't in the promised land. And that was part of God's plan. And what he said in Exodus 6, look at 7 and 8, I will take you as my own people, I will be your God, and you will know I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. And I will bring you into the land I swore with uplifted hand to give to Abraham. God's pretty stuck on this, isn't he? He says, I actually raised my hand and not only picked a people and not only gave them a land, but I promised to bring you back to the land. That's why it's called the promised land. To give to Abraham, and of Abraham's many children to Isaac, and of Isaac's 2 children to Jacob. See how God localizes and identifies where the promised line is? And I will give it to you, verse 8 says, as a possession. And then look how he signs it. I am the Lord. That means I'm going to do what I said. That means I promised it, and whatever it takes, I will accomplish it. That's God's promise. So, that's the third pile. If we were to take all the promises, the first promise is God would pick a people, and it would be through Abraham's line. The second promise is that he would give them a specific land. And the third promise is that when they left that land, that he would bring them back to that land. Now, the fourth set of promises is in Leviticus, so keep going to the right. Leviticus 26. And God promised to judge his chosen people of destiny if they forgot him in the promised land. And Leviticus 26, from 14 to 44, is a long line of all kinds of God's warnings to them. And it's all these promised judgments that come upon them. Leviticus 26, 14 to 44. It's kind of gruesome to read those, all the horrible things. But when the Jewish people entered the promised land, God warned them if they practice idolatry and the immorality of the Canaanites, he would cast them out. And he did. That's what Babylon did to the south. That's what Assyria did to the north. He cast them out. In fact, it says in Deuteronomy 28, that they would live doubting they were going to make it through every day, that God would judge them so much. Number 5, and this is where we ended last time, go to the next book, Deuteronomy. This is where we're going to start tonight, Deuteronomy 28. And I want to show you something. God promised to scatter the people, not just judge them, but God was going to do something unlike to any other people group. He was going to scatter them for hundreds and thousands of years. And he was going to take them, and it says, scatter them to the furthest corners of the earth. And if you look at Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 64, and this is the 5th promise God made. God promised to scatter his unfaithful but chosen people out from the promised land. This is what he said. Then the Lord will scatter you among all nations. Now, there have been deportations of people groups. I mean, it's happened all the time. You know, stuff like that goes on all the time around the world. But never do you uproot one nation, let's say, you know, like El Salvador, and take all the El Salvadorians out of El Salvador and spread them, look what it says, among all the nations. Only God could do that. Now, nowadays, you know, I mean, you can find Filipino housekeepers in almost every country of the world. I'm not talking about people getting a job. I'm talking about forcible deportation and being scattered by persecution and by danger all over the world. But look what it says, verse 64, the Lord will scatter you among all nations from one end of the earth to the other. There you will worship other gods, gods of wood and stone, which neither you or your fathers have known. So God promised to scatter them. He says, you don't believe in me, I'm going to scatter you. But the problem is, he said, you'll never be able to lose your identity. You'll never be able to get into the woodwork.